All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for the second of our summer Open Beit Midrash programs. My name is Michael Frada. I'm the Assistant Program Director for Drisha, and we are thrilled to be able to offer these opportunities to give everyone a bit of a taste of the sort of learning that we are doing over the summer. Drisha normally runs 2 full-time learning intensives, the Dr. Beth Samuel's high school program for young women in high school, as well as the summer kollel for college and post-college adults who are interested in intensive learning. And we have been able to adapt both of those programs to an online format this summer. And we're thrilled to have the opportunity to share some of the kind of material that we've been working on in this year's kollel, which is specifically geared toward learning Talmud and exploring the different angles and different valences of what Talmud can be and the different ways that one can approach learning it. So this evening we have Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens with us. He is here to discuss the topic of philosophical scissors in the hands of the rabbis. It's going to be an opportunity to see what happens when we read a piece of Talmud through the angle of philosophy of language. And Rabbi Dr. Lebens comes to us with, he's in addition to being a teacher at Drisha Summer Kollel, he's also a postdoc research fellow in the philosophy department at the University of Haifa. Has past been a fellow at Rutgers University at Notre Dame and has a PhD in metaphysics from the University of London. He's also studied at Yeshivat HaKotel, Yeshivat HaMivtar, and Yeshivat Har Etzion, and received smicha from Rav Zalman Nechem Goldberg. So we're thrilled to have him here this evening, as well as thrilled to have him as part of our summer kollel in general. Rabbi Lebens.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here virtually with you this evening, or this morning as it is here in Haifa in Israel. It's 2 in the morning. So far, Thursday is cracking out to be a really good day. So I can tell you because I'm already here. It's looking good. It is also my pleasure to be involved with Drisha and to be teaching at this summer kollel. Normally, when I come to the kollel in the summer, I teach philosophy. Jewish philosophy. I'll often do it through classical rabbinical texts. I'm very interested in philosophy that's in conversation with Midrash, philosophy in conversation with Chassidut. But I was asked specifically this year to focus on Talmud because the theme of the kollel really has been Gemara learning in multiple different ways. So what I've been doing is over the course of 2 weeks, we've taken 2 quite classic yeshivish sugyas, discussions in the Talmud. One that's to do with action and different categories of action in the halakha. So some actions are considered to be Bermazid, which means done on purpose. And if you were to transgress one of the commandments on purpose, Bermazid, you have the highest possible degree of culpability. Another category of action is to act b'shogeg, which roughly means accidentally. Now, accidents can be avoided, and if people are very careful, they can avoid at least certain sorts of accidents. So an action that is b'shogeg is much less culpable, of course, than an action committed Bermazid, but it's not as if there's no culpability at all. A third category of action in the halacha is an action that was ba'ones, which means an action that was performed under some sort of compulsion from another, at gunpoint, let's say. That type of action carries no culpability whatsoever. But there's this fourth category that the Talmud tries to define, but it's a little bit slippery. It's called the category of mitasek, which is somewhere between an action that was compelled and an action that was culpably accidental. And we spent a whole week learning the Talmudic discussions around this, following those discussions through the medieval and later commentaries. But what I tried to show the students was that a working knowledge of contemporary philosophy of action could actually help the student of the Talmud to better understand the various debates that we were studying in the classical rabbinic texts. Now this week, we've been focusing on a different Talmudic sugya, a different Talmudic discussion that's known as Palginan Dibura, which literally means we divide the statement. And we've been learning the sources very in depth, looking again at the Rishonim line by line. And I'm not going to do that with you today, but I'm going to give you a taste of the sort of conversation that I've been trying to facilitate between the classical rabbinic texts and contemporary, or at least 20th and 21st century philosophy. And this sugya, this discussion about Palginan Dibura, we divide the statement, comes up in many places in Shas, many places in the Talmud. But the one we're going to focus on today starts in Masechet Gittin on Daf Chet Amud Bet. And there they quote a Breita, a Tanaitic text, a really ancient rabbinic text, which imagines a slave. So we're talking about times in which slavery was legal and common. A slave came, let's say, to Israel from overseas, and he had in his hand a writ of emancipation from his master. But the writ of emancipation read as follows. It said, let's say in the handwriting of his master, "You are freed, and my other belongings are transferred to you." And this document was signed and it was all, kosher. Now, the rabbis in general are pretty eager to trust a writ of emancipation. And one of the reasons I assume they're pretty eager to trust a writ of emancipation is that they like the idea of freeing slaves. But they are less eager to trust a document from a foreign country that transfers property from one person to another. And in fact, if a document from overseas that claims to be transferring property from one person to another is used in another country, the Bet Din, the rabbinical court, will want to go through a procedure called Kiyum Shtarot, which means something like document verification. And document verification, Kiyum Shtarot, is a procedure in which witnesses need to come before the court and testify that the signatures that they see on this document are bona fide. And here, this document is serving two purposes. One is to free the slave, but the other purpose is to transfer all of the belongings of the master to the slave. So the rabbis, they don't require Kiyum Shtarot, document verification, for a writ of emancipation, but they do require Kiyum Shtarot, document verification, for the transfer of the rest of the belongings. Well, this is quite simple. And the Breita says exactly what we should do. We should take scissors to the statement and cut it in two, right? there's one part, you are freed, which we can act upon immediately without kiyum shtarot. The other part we can just put to one side for now. If later on you're able to bring witnesses to verify the signatures on the document, then we'll transfer all of the property over to you. But in the meantime, we'll act on one part of the document, the writ of emancipation, and the rest we'll just have to wait until we can verify it. And that's what the Breiter says. That's what this Talmudic text says. And it's actually very much, even though it's an older text, it's very much in tune with the attitude of Rava the Babylonian Amorah, who in a number of cases right throughout Shas, right throughout the Talmud, says that there are times where the testimony that comes before the court is only partially usable. Don't worry, cut out the bits that you can use and discard the bits you can't use. Palginan dibura, we divide the statement. Well, that looks like what's happening here in this Breiter. But then, Rava and Abaye have a debate. They ask about a case that the Breiter doesn't discuss, but that interests them nonetheless. They imagine a theoretical case in which a slave comes from overseas and he holds in his hand a document with the handwriting of his master signed by two Adim that says, all of my belongings are transferred to you. Now, the dark reality of slavery sorry, I muted myself by accident. I can't do that when I'm teaching real classes. I never accidentally mute myself in the flesh. But anyway, the imaginary case is, the dark reality of slavery is that a slave was one of the belongings of his or her master. So this document says, all of my belongings are transferred to you. That includes a transfer of ownership of the slave to himself. So the idea is the slave is one of the possessions that's being given to the slave. In other words, there is a writ of emancipation here included in the language of all of my belongings are transferred to you. Now in case one, it was a conjunction. A, you are freed, and B, all of my belongings are given to you. And it was easy to cut that into two, to act immediately upon the emancipation part of the document, and to leave until later, leave until when we're able to verify the signatures, the transfer of the rest of the goods. But what do we do with this case? Well, I couldn't find a picture of Rava and Abaye for my PowerPoint. And I asked my colleague at Drisha, Rav Shlomo Zukia, whether it would be disrespectful to use Bert and Ernie as pictures in the PowerPoint. And he didn't give me a decisive no. So here is Bert. Okay, we'll see him in a second. He's going to represent Abaye. Okay. And Abaye says, you can see what happened with the scissors there. One second, if I go back a little bit. There's nowhere to cut this. There's nowhere to cut here. It's not clear how to cut this into two parts. One part you can use and one part you can't use. And that's exactly what Abaye says. Abaye's point is, in this case, either we have to transfer all of the master's property, including the slave himself, right, without kiyum shtarot, without document verification, or we transfer nothing until we have kiyum shtarot, document verification. Because this just isn't the sort of testimony that we can divide. If you like, there's no clearly delineated dotted line along which our scissors can cut this document into two parts, one part that we're able to act upon and one part that we can wait until later for. But Rava says, why not? And Rava imagines this is how we can cut the sentence into two. Look carefully at the slide. We can basically just cross it out altogether and replace it with, you were freed. Well, the strange thing is, when Rava is asked, what's your rationale? He says, Palgin and Dibura. We can divide the statement. But this doesn't look like a division of the statement. It looks like he's deleted the statement and replaced it with a completely different statement. And the question I wanted to get to the bottom of is, what are Abaye and Rava really arguing about? What is this argument really about? And it seems to me that something like this is what's going on. Rava looks at the phrase, all my belongings are transferred to you. And he says, I'll tell you what that means. That means this. My car is transferred to you. My iPad is transferred to you. My unicycle is transferred to you. My right sock is transferred to you. My left sock is transferred to you. My money is transferred to you. You, being one of my possessions because you're my slave, are transferred to you. In other words, when the master wrote the words, all my belongings are transferred to you, he was actually writing down a shorthand or an abbreviation for this long list, this itemized list that we see here on the scroll. Hadassah Weiner asks, can a slave be freed then without a transfer of the property that the slave is? That is, what does freedom mean if the slave doesn't receive himself in possession? That's very nice. Well, I think I'll explain what Rava wants to say. What Rava wants to say is, well, we can do Palgin and Dibura on this list. We can say all of those things at the top of the list will cut away. We'll wait until we can get document verification for those items of the list. But this item of the list, which stands alone, you were transferred to you, is equivalent to saying you were freed. So this is a writ of emancipation. We can cut out the parts that we're not able to act upon and take out the one part we are able to act upon. That's what Rava's saying. But Abaye is saying, no. The phrase, all my belongings are transferred to you, that's not an abbreviation for a long itemized list of possessions. It's one statement, not a conjunction of multiple statements. It's one statement. All my belongings are transferred to you. In other words, the argument between Abaye and Rava could be as simple as this. Is a generalization an abbreviated list? Rava says yes, and Abaye says no. Rava says a generalization is an abbreviated list, and because it's really just a list, an itemized list of possessions, we can cut out those parts that aren't relevant for the court proceedings today and act upon those parts which are relevant to today and free the slave. Abaye, on the other hand, says no, a generalization is something completely different to a list of particular things. And because it's completely different to a list of particular things, there's no obvious dotted line along which our philosophical scissors can cut the testimony into two, can cut the document into two. So far, so good, I hope. But it turns out that this debate about whether a generalization can be analyzed in terms of a list was really a heated debate between Bertrand Russell and his student Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, in one of the most impenetrable books of the 20th century, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he wrote that when I say that, and here there's some symbolic jargon, but it means something like this. When I say that everything has a certain property, what I say can actually be analyzed away in terms of the potentially infinitely long conjunction. A has the property, and B has the property, and C has the property. So for example, when I say that I give all of my property to Hadassah, I could get rid of the word all, and I could just say, I give my right glove to Hadassah, my left glove to Hadassah, my right sock to Hadassah, my left sock to Hadassah. I can replace any generalization with a long list of instances, and then you don't need the generalization at all. That was what Wittgenstein said. Now, Russell was not moved by this, because he said, you can't get rid so easily of generality in terms of a long conjunction. Let's imagine that I own only 3 things. Let's call these things A, B, and C. They're the only things I own in the world. Okay. Now I say, oh, I give all of my things to Hadassah. Well, that's going to entail that I give A to Hadassah, and that I give B to Hadassah, and that I give C to Hadassah. So sure, the generalization entails the list. But the list, I give A to Hadassah, I give B to Hadassah, and I give C to Hadassah. That list doesn't entail that I give everything to Hadassah, not until you know the extra fact that A, B, and C are all of the things I own. So the generalization entails the list, but the list doesn't entail the generalization unless you add a further item to the list. An item that says, oh, by the way, the things above me on the list, that's all the things there are. But that final item on the list is a generalization. It uses the word all, right? Oh, by the way, A, B, and C are all the things I own. So you can't get rid of the word all and just replace it with a list of instances. That's what Bertrand Russell said. Now, in the class, I read this long paragraph here. I'm going to skip it, but it was me trying to explain more thoroughly why Wittgenstein came to the conclusion he came to. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But what I want to say straight away is that Wittgenstein, when he looks at a generalization and says, oh, that generalization, that might as well just be a list, he's agreeing with Rava. And when Russell looks at the generalization and says that generalization can't just as well have been a list, there's something irreparably and irrevocably general about a generalization that can't be explained away in terms of a list, he's agreeing with Abaye. That was the first thing I wanted to point out. I also wanted to explain that there are philosophical pitfalls in both directions. So Wittgenstein and, by hypothesis, Rava face the objection about entailment. Yes, it's true that the generalization entails a list, but it's not true that the list entails the generalization. So how can you say that the two things mean the same thing? It's a philosophical problem that Wittgenstein has to face with his account. But Russell has to face a number of paradoxes that Wittgenstein was trying to escape from. Let's imagine, right, that whenever you have a group of things, A, B, and C, that there's also the thing that they comprise. So imagine you've got John, Paul, Ringo, and George. That's 4 things. But they together make up a 5th thing. The 5th thing is called the Beatles. So let's imagine that whenever you have some number of things, you automatically have an extra thing, the thing that they comprise, the thing that they make, the set that they belong to. If you assume that, it seems reasonable to assume, you're going to end up with something called the Russell paradox. How so? Okay, take all of the dogs in the world, okay? Now, on our assumption, if you've got lots and lots of things, you can put them together and create a group. So now we've got an extra thing called the set of dogs. Very nice. I want you to note that the set of dogs is not a dog. All of its members are dogs, but it is not a dog. Okay, Yoffie, good. Now, here's another example. Some sets have 4 members, like the set of beetles, although it's arguable because there are a number of people who contend to be the 5th beetle, but we won't get into that, right? Some sets have a small number of members. Some sets have a very, very large number of members, like the set of residents of New York City. Right? The set of residents of New York City has a very, very large number of members. Well, let's take all of the sets that have more than 10 members. Okay? That set, the set of all sets with more than 10 members, is a member of itself because it has many more, it is a set and it has many more than 10 members. So now we've seen some sets are members of themselves and some sets are not members of themselves. So now we can talk about, bear with me, this is really quite difficult. We can talk about the set of sets that are not members of themselves. So for instance, the set of British bands, the set of British rock bands, that set is not a rock band. The set of dogs is not a dog. The set of air conditioners is not an air conditioner. The set of even numbers is not itself an even number. Take every set that isn't a member of itself, and we'll get a new thing called the set of sets that are not members of themselves. Now, is that set a member of itself? And this is the Russell paradox. This is the set of sets that are not members of themselves. This set will be a member of itself, but only if it's not a member of itself. And if it's not a member of itself, it will be a member of itself. Contradiction. It's a paradox. And believe it or not, this paradox really shook the foundations of number theory and mathematics at the turn of the last century, because set theory, the theory of groups and sets, was central at that time to the attempt to systematize number theory and to define numbers. Frege, the great German mathematician, when he discovered Russell's paradox, he described the entire mathematical universe tottering on its foundations. Now, how does this paradox get going? It gets going from the assumption that whenever you have A, B, and C, you also have an extra thing, the thing that A, B, and C comprise. Now remember, Russell thinks if you have the fact that Sam owns A, and you have the fact that Sam owns B, and you have the fact that Sam owns C, there's also another fact, the fact that A, B, and C are all the things that Sam own. For Wittgenstein, there's just 3 facts. Sam owns A, Sam owns B, Sam owns C. And when you say, you know, Sam gives Hadassah everything, all you really mean is Sam gives Hadassah A, Sam gives Hadassah B, Sam gives Hadassah C. But according to Russell, there's a 4th thing here. Not just the fact that Sam owns A, not just the fact that Sam owns B, not just the fact that Sam owns C, but this 4th thing called the fact that A, B, and C are all the things that Sam owns. And it's that addition of facts that puts you on the path towards things like the Russell paradox. It's when you've got, you don't just have Paul, John, George, and Ringo, 4 things, but you have an extra 5th thing called, oh, the Beatles. It's what's going to get you on the road to paradox. So both sides of this debate between Russell and Wittgenstein had costs. But here's the thing that you should be asking, and if you were to ask it, you'd be right to ask it. But surely Rava wasn't worried about the Russell paradox, right? And surely Abaye hadn't stumbled upon the entailment argument against Wittgenstein's analysis of the universal quantifier. And that's right. I don't really think Russell and Wittgenstein's debate is exactly what Abaye and Rava were getting at. But I do think the Russell and Wittgenstein's debate helps us to think along the right lines as to what the real debate was between Abaye and Rava. And I'm going to try and describe that to you now. I think that a massive part of the problem that is at issue here between Abaye and Rava has to do with human intention. Now, in Jewish law, if you want to transfer property, there are two intentions that are crucial. The previous owner needs to intend to transfer the item to the new owner, and the new owner needs to intend to receive the item. It's called dat makneh and dat koneh, right? The intention of the bequeather, let's call it, and the intention of the purchaser. And if there's a failing in either of these intentions, then in actual fact, the transaction is null and void. And I think perhaps the question here is, how many of you, I wonder, could right now itemize all of your possessions? I certainly couldn't. I couldn't itemize all of my possessions. So if I wrote a document that says, you know, I give all of my possessions to Hadassah, could I have had in mind every single one of my possessions? Another way of asking that question is, can you refer to something with which you're not acquainted? So I'm going to come back to Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell had a distinction between knowledge by acquaintance and knowledge by description. Some things you know about, but you've never seen them directly. So I have never stood anywhere near the Great Wall of China, but I've heard a lot about it. So I know the Great Wall of China by description. Other people have described it to me, I could describe it to you, but I've never seen it. Things with which I'm directly acquainted with, according to Russell, have a special status because I don't merely have the ability to describe them, I'm also able to name them. So according to Russell, a name is a very special type of a word. A name is the primary vehicle by which a mind reaches out to the world outside of it. And when I say, you know, when you say Sam to refer to me, if you're acquainted with me, says Russell, then your use of the word reaches right out and points to me. When I think of this theory, I think often of the Hebrew for the word name, which is Shem. Shem is homographic with Sham, right? Sham means there. Sham, the word there is a demonstrative. You use it to point at things in your locale. You use the word Sham to point to things in your surroundings. You use names to point to things. And Russell said, when you use the word Sam, you may have all sorts of descriptions in your head. You might be thinking of the guy with the British accent and the scraggly beard. You might be thinking of the guy giving this lecture right now. There's all sorts of descriptions you might have in your head. Frankly, I don't want to know all of them because they might not all be all that complimentary, but you all have certain descriptions in your head that pop up when you use the word Sam. But if you're acquainted with me, the word Sam isn't some sort of abbreviation for one of those descriptions. The fact that you're acquainted with me means you can use the word Sam to point directly at me, to bypass any kind of description and point directly at me. I can't point directly at the Great Wall of China with language because I'm not acquainted with it. I can only describe it. But you can point directly to me by using the word Sam if you're acquainted with me. Now, one reason you might want to reject this whole theory is I use names all the time without being acquainted with people. I've never met Elizabeth II, but I can use that name. But you see here, Russell will say, if I'm not acquainted with her, then when I use the name, I'm using it as an abbreviated description. What the name means when I use it is whatever description might be in the back of my mind when I use it. But if I'm acquainted with someone, then when I use their name, my name means nothing more than them. It reaches right out to the world and points to them. So if you were Russell, you'd say, look, if you don't even know all the things that you own, if you couldn't provide me with an itemized list of all the things that you own, if you're not acquainted with all of the things that you own, then you certainly couldn't refer to them all. But there are some people that say, oh, that's silly. There isn't a really important distinction here between referring and describing. Perhaps all names are descriptions, and there's not a difference between people you've met and people you haven't met. Or perhaps names are special, but you don't need to be acquainted with a person to use a name, right? So here's the question: can you refer to something with which you're not acquainted? And perhaps what's happening here is Rava is saying, yes, you can. And therefore, even though you couldn't provide me with an itemized list of all the things that you own, somehow, when you said, I give you all of the things I own, you managed to refer to every single item on that itemized list, even if you're not necessarily acquainted with them all. That's the power of language. You managed to refer to them all. And perhaps Abaye is with Russell, saying, no way, you can't refer directly to every single item on a list if you're not acquainted with all of the items on the list. Now, what arguments might we have for one side of this debate and the other side of this debate? Well, I'll start with a defense of Rava. Okay, so Rava says, I am able to refer to all of the things that I own, even if I couldn't provide you with an itemized list. Why might he say such a thing? Well, I want to rehearse for you now an argument by the British philosopher Mark Sainsbury, who lives and teaches in Texas now, at the University of Texas at Austin. He says, imagine the following story. One morning I go downstairs to my pantry and I find that a lot of the containers of my food have been ripped. And I surmise that there's some sort of mouse coming into the pantry. So I call the mouse Freddy. I just, decide to name him Freddy. I've never seen him. I'm not even sure he exists. It's just a hypothesis. It's the best way to explain the torn up food containers in my pantry. So I say, oh, I think there's a mouse. Let's call him Freddy. Then the next night, because I'm curious about Freddy, I pour some flour on the floor of my pantry and go to bed. And in the morning when I come down, I see these little mouse prints, which confirm my hypothesis. I say, oh, Freddy's been running around my pantry, that naughty little mouse. And then the next evening, I'm getting obsessive about Freddy. I install a CCTV camera. And the next morning I wake up and I look at this grainy footage and I just about can make out a mouse scampering around. I say, oh, look, there's Freddy. The next night I stay up all night, perhaps because I'm going to be teaching a class for Drisha and the time zones are, unfriendly or even inhumane. And I wait up all night and guess what? I see Freddy face to face. I stare him in the eyes. Now, according to Russell, at some point in this story, an amazing transformation took place. The word Freddy began as a description, a disguised description. And all it meant was the thing that's coming into my pantry, or something like that. But at some point in this story, it stopped being a description and it became a name. When exactly? Was seeing the footprints enough? Was seeing the grainy footage on the CCTV camera enough? Or did it wait until I saw him in the eyes? I looked him in the eyes that night? To Mark Sainsbury, it sounds as if the changes in the story are too gradual to support the notion that at some point along the story, there was a radical shift in meaning or semantic function of the word Freddie. No, Freddie meant the same thing all along the story. There was never like a point along the way where, oh, now it's changed its dictionary definition. That just doesn't seem plausible to Mark Sainsbury. And so what we could learn, is what Sainsbury wants us to learn, is that we are able to refer to things even before we're acquainted with them. Another lesson you could draw from it is that maybe there's no such thing as reference. All we can ever do is describe. And maybe that's okay, right? Fine. So that's one side of the debate. Here's what we can say on Russell's behalf. Russell had a correspondence with that mathematician I mentioned, Gottlob Frege. And Russell was of the opinion that when I think about the world, I'm always using ingredients with which I'm directly acquainted, so to speak, to picture new situations. So, for example, I'm acquainted with my brother James, and I'm acquainted with the Mediterranean Sea, and I'm acquainted with water skiing as an action. I've seen that. So even though I've never seen my brother James water skiing, I'm able to picture my brother James water skiing. How am I able to picture it? I take the three real worldly items that I'm acquainted with, James, the sea, and water skis, and I put them together. I arrange them in my mind. But it's important to note that for Russell, the things I'm arranging in my mind are not representations of James and the sea and skis. It's James himself and the Mediterranean Sea itself and skis itself, because the mind has the ability to reach out to the world that's beyond it and to encompass things outside of it. Even when I describe something that I've never seen, like the Great Wall of China, still, in order to understand the description, I'm going to have to use ingredients with which I am acquainted to construct a mental picture. So I've seen bricks before, right? And I've seen walls before. And I use these things with which I'm acquainted to construct a mental picture. He wrote about this in a correspondence with Gottlob Frege. And Frege's response to Russell was incredulity. He said, what? So you think Mont Blanc being the tallest mountain in Europe, you think Mont Blanc, along with all of its snowfields, is a constituent of your thought that Mont Blanc is 7,000 meters tall? And Russell said, yeah, the mountain itself really is a constituent of my thought. My mind reaches out directly to the mountain. It can do that to things with which it's acquainted. Now, Frege thought that was ridiculous, as if you could fit the entire mountain in one of my thoughts. Frege thought it obvious that when you think about Mont Blanc, all of the constituents of your thoughts are symbols. You have a mental representation of Mont Blanc. You have a mental representation of the number 7,000. You have a mental representation of the notion of a meter. And you use those mental representations to create the thought that Mont Blanc is 7,000 meters tall. But Russell was worried. And he said, if that's true, how can we be sure that we ever break through the veil of symbols and actually reach the world? How do you know that your mental representation of Mont Blanc really is a representation of Mont Blanc? Maybe it's a representation of something else. Now take the thought, my mental representation is a representation of Mont Blanc. Does that thought contain Mont Blanc? Or does it just contain two different symbols for Mont Blanc, right? For Frege, it's symbols all the way down. And this is Russell's fear. This is why I have this quite disturbing picture appear on the PowerPoint. Russell's fear is that we get trapped in the prison of our own minds if we're not capable sometimes of reaching out directly, not through some symbol or other, but directly in our thought to the world outside of us. We get trapped in the prison of our own mind behind a wall of mental paint unless our thoughts have the ability to encompass things outside of our minds. So Rava has on his side this story about Freddie, which just makes it very implausible that we need to be acquainted with things before we can refer to them. But Abaye has on his side the kind of anti-skeptical thought that surely there's a difference between symbolizing something with which you're not acquainted and literally reaching out beyond your mind to the things with which you are, the non-symbolic things with which you are directly acquainted. And now I go all the way back to our first slide. I see a comment, so I'll take that. Not our first slide, I'm going to go to this slide. Drisha, question from Facebook. Oh, Gemma Silver, that's nice. Would Russell expect everyone to be able to provide an itemized list of everything they're acquainted with? It feels like this is unrealistic. Does the set of things I'm acquainted with become itself descriptive? Yes, Gemma, I really do think Russell thought, at least at some period, with Russell, he's a moving target. It's very, very difficult to say what did Russell think because he was always changing his mind. And it's a constant fascination of Russell scholarship is to try to figure out what he thought at any given point in his evolving career. But certainly at some points along the way, Russell thought that you are only acquainted with the things that you really could itemize. And at any given time, you might only be acquainted with quite a small number of things. He thought you were, at some points, he thought you were only directly acquainted with the things that you were directly perceiving at a given moment, right? Which he called your sense data. But it was an evolving picture, so it's a bit of a difficult answer, a bit of a difficult question to answer for Gemma. But I think that even without an answer, we will be able, I hope, at the in the next couple of minutes, to really understand what Abaye might have been thinking, even if Russell remains a little bit elusive. Okay, so here's my thought, right? When a person says all my belongings are transferred to you, he somehow manages to refer to every single thing that he owns, even if he's not necessarily directly acquainted with them and couldn't itemize them himself. That's what he succeeds in doing. He succeeds in referring to all of the things that he owns. And since he's managed to do that, what he has said is, just as Wittgenstein would later think, a long conjunction, because he literally referred to each and every item that he owned by saying, all my belongings are transferred to you. He referred to his car, he referred to his iPad, he referred to his unicycle, his right sock, his left sock, his money, and to the slave in question. And therefore, we can invoke the principle of Palgin and Dibura, cut out all of those items, those discrete items on the list that we're not yet able to act upon because we need to do this procedure called kiyum shtarot, document verification. But we can act upon this one item that we don't cut away, the emancipation of the slave. And Abaye, who would very much like to emancipate the slave, in fact, his first thought is, well, why don't we just give everything without kiyum shtarot in this case, because we can't divide here. And ultimately, under some pressure from Rabbi, he says, okay, let's not give him anything until he's able to do kiyum shtarot. But what's the thought? The thought is that this document does not itemize all of the possessions that the master had, because the master simply wasn't acquainted with all of his possessions. That's not something he couldn't have referred to them all. Instead, this document issues something like an instruction. The instruction is something like this: for any X, if you find that X belongs to me, please transfer it to so-and-so, right? For any X, if you find that X belongs to me, it's now yours. Now that's an instruction. It's not a long, long list of items. And since it's an instruction, the principle of Palginun Dibura, which in a nutshell looks for, so to speak, dotted lines in a document or a testimony that allows us to treat one part separately from another. There are no dotted lines here. There's nowhere for the philosophical scissors to cut. So Abaye says that we have to treat this document as a single unit. It stands or falls all at once and all together. It's not the list of discrete items that Rabbi thought it was. What are they arguing about? Not the Russell paradox, not Wittgenstein's analysis of universal quantification, but they are, I think, plausibly arguing about how the mind is able to relate to the world that it thinks about. I think that's part of what they're arguing about. I think plausibly what they're arguing about is the sorts of intentions we're able to form. Are you able to inform an intention about every single discrete item that you own? Or are you not able to form an intention like that? And instead you can form a more general intention, something like an instruction. For any X, if it turns out that X belongs to me, please give it to so-and-so. So it's an argument about, so to speak, the structure of human intentions and possible intentions. And in the context of the week of classes that I've been giving in Drisha, in the Kollel, what I've tried to show is that it's actually very, very difficult to explain this argument between Abaye and Rava in any other way. We've seen in Masechet Sanhedrin a whole load of reasons for rejecting the notion of Palginun Dibura, splitting a statement. We've seen in Masechet Ketubot a whole host of reasons for objecting to Palginun Dibura, the idea of splitting up testimony or documents. But none of the reasons for opposing Palginun Dibura seem to be operative in this debate between Abaye and Rava. Why then is Abaye opposing Palginun Dibura over here? It should be a completely uncontroversial take on Palginun Dibura. But there was a controversy. What was a controversy about? And what I was trying to demonstrate to my students is sometimes, you know, in modern Orthodoxy, which is kind of the area of the community, the Jewish community with which I'm affiliated, we often talk about deference for secular studies in the university. But when it comes to learning Talmud, the only kind of academic science that's used are historical, philological in Jewish studies departments. And very often, they're really not engaged in the same project as the yeshiva. The project of the yeshiva isn't to figure out the history behind the text that's called the Talmud. The project of the yeshiva is to continue on the legal tradition of scholarship and interpretation that the Talmud began. And the Talmud is very often quite ahistorical in its own scholarship. That's to say, the Amoraim didn't often bother about the original intent of the Tanaim when they discuss older sources. Instead, they're like jurists or judges who are trying to expand, so to speak, the palace of Torah, to use the language of Tomaros, trying to expand the palace of Torah to meet new challenges and new situations. But I think that there are many other disciplines in the university that are much better suited for modern Orthodox study of the Talmud than perhaps the academic study of Talmud, which is a historical, critical study. What I've tried to show in this class is that perhaps knowledge of such things as Russell and Wittgenstein and Mark Sainsbury can help to unpack or to shed new light upon ancient discussions between Abaye and Rava that might otherwise leave us bemused. I have just a couple of minutes and I saw another question come up and I will read it, but there's one more thing I wanted to say, which was that one of my students came up with a really beautiful alternative interpretation of this whole debate. I was like, yes, Drisha student. And the alternative was pretty simple. It's just that Abaye says, you can't free a person without giving him some belongings. If you free him and he has no belongings whatsoever, what sort of freedom is that? And Rava says, no, we can free him without any belongings. We'll talk about the belongings another time. And that's very interesting as well philosophically, because it brings me to think of Isaiah Berlin and his two conceptions of freedom. Negative freedom being the freedom from other people constricting your choices, which is a slave suffers from a loss of negative freedom. But positive freedom is what you have when you have the ability to flourish. And a person who has absolutely no properties, no chance of social mobility, no social security, no access to healthcare, etc., suffers from a tremendous deficit in positive freedom. And perhaps that would be another way of understanding this debate, not a technical debate about the grammar of Palgin and Dibura, but an ethical or metaphysical debate about the nature of freedom. The reason, by the way, I still favor my interpretation is Rava says, the reason that I do this, the reason that I free this slave is because Palgin and Dibura, because we're able to cut up a testimony, we're able to cut up a document. And that's why I would still, despite my students' very beautiful Peirush, I would still rather explain Abaye's opposition to Rava as a principled opposition to the use of Palgin and Dibura in contexts like this. And that's why I end up where I end up. Hannah Weiner writes here, another example you might want to consider is Magritte's painting, the Trahison des Images, the treachery of images, otherwise known as "ce n'est pas une pipe," this is not a pipe, to distinguish between the representation of a thing and the thing. Absolutely. And we spoke about similar works of art this morning in class, this afternoon in class. Anyway, that's all I had to say on the issue, and I just wanted to give you kind of a taste of how I'm trying to bring philosophy into the Bet Midrash for the students at Drisha this summer. And that's the end. Thank you. If people are interested in hearing more from me in particular, my website, samlebens.com, has a weekly Dvar Torah. It also has all of my academic publications for those who want to see more.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Rabbi Lebens. This has been really, really fascinating, a really amazing opportunity to share some of what is going on. I want to quickly take the opportunity to highlight our next public program, which is going to be our Tisha B'Av programming coming up next week. And so let me see, I'm going to give a little more detail about that, but we are going to have programs running both Wednesday night, Leil Tisha B'Av, and then Thursday during the day. You can see a brief listing right here. On Wednesday night, we are going to have a reading of Megillah Eicha, as well as a talk from Rabbi David Silber, founder and dean of Drisha. And on Thursday, we are going to have a keynote, a discussion of various keynote led by Drisha faculty, as well as a series of classes in the afternoon from folks who are affiliated with Drisha, who have taught here in the past, or in some cases, guest lecturers. You can join by going to our Facebook Live page. You can register via Zoom or on our website. And more information about that will be available on our website and on our Facebook page throughout the coming week as well. I'm going to post the link to the post that I just shared, both in Zoom and on Facebook, so that folks can get that information now if they would like to. But again, I just want to thank everyone for being here, and especially a huge thank you to Rabbi Lebens for a really fun, thought-provoking approach to how we put some of these things in conversation with each other. Thank you all again so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you.